welcome to another edition of Lockdown Recipes for Disaster. I'm Pete Goffe-Wood. In this installment, I'm going to show you how to cook the perfect steak. The fabulous people at Cape Wagyu dropped off the most gorgeous slab of Wagyu ribeye that I'm going to throw on the fire today. I can't wait to get stuck in. Before we get cooking, we need to talk about something very important when it comes to cooking steak, and that's the shopping. What do we look for when we buy a good steak? There are a number of things. First, ideally you want something dry aged. 28 to 35 days is usually at its optimum. What does dry aging do? Dry aging, basically, the butcher has left the cut of meat on the bone and let it dry out in either a specific ager or a fridge. And what that does is, as that cut of meat loses moisture, so the flavor intensifies and it gets tastier and it gets more tender, but you start to get a beautiful steak on the go. So we're looking for dry aged. Color wise, you don't want this bright red meat that you're often faced with in the supermarket. You want something with a more muted color, deeper red, more purple color. This says that the beef is aged and also it's from an older animal. A little bit more exercise, a little bit more oxygenated, and also a better layer of fat. Looking for yellow fat on the outside, that's also a good indication of aging. Marbling is something we'll talk about a little bit later. Let's jump straight into our steak ingredients. I've got some soft butter, finely diced onions, garlic, chopped rosemary, red wine, salt, pepper, local olive oil, Worcestershire sauce, and these two bad boys, Wagyu ribeye. We'll start with our compound butter, get that out of the way before we start talking steak and everything that goes with it. So, warm pan as usual. I'm going to add my diced onions and my garlic. Now, what we want to do now is to add our red wine to this. As you can see, our mixture's come up to the boil. We just want to let that reduce down completely. We want to cook all of the liquid off of this. Okay, here we go. You can see our liquid has started to evaporate. We just get this lovely purple onions and garlic left. That's exactly what we want. We want this to carry on cooking down until there's virtually no liquid left in the pan. We don't have to cook this completely dry, but we want no residual wine left in the pan. All we got left are these onions and garlic that really just soaked up all that red wine. Now, the important thing is we've got to get this to cool down before we can add our butter to it, otherwise the butter is just going to melt. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer this into a bowl. It'll cool down much faster than if I leave it in the pot. Our base is now chilled enough that we can put our butter in. It doesn't have to be ice cold. I'm going to throw in my rosemary. Now, I didn't cook the rosemary with the base because I wanted to keep a nice fresh taste. You could add other herbs to this. Thyme works particularly well. Sage would also be quite nice. Now in goes our soft butter. I'm going to just season this because this is unsalted butter. Now we're just going to mix this in and we'll have this fantastic purple butter. So there we have it, nicely mixed in. It's a beautiful purple sort of color. We're going to leave that just set a little bit and for the flavors to infuse, and then we're going to spoon a bit of that onto our freshly grilled steak. Let's talk steak. We've got some prime Wagyu to deal with, and that's a great way to illustrate what I'm talking about internal, external fat. So external fat of prime cuts, you're looking at these big white chunks around the back here. This is the obvious, like the long piece of fat that runs down the length of a sirloin on a rump. That external fat is going to crisp up on the fire or in the pan and add beautiful taste. But we're talking about important internal fat, marbling. We're looking at this. If you see these little white flecks, this is internal fat. Now this is marbling of about 7 or 8 for a Wagyu, so this is particularly spectacular. You're not going to find this in your average steak. But these little flecks, what's going to happen to these little flecks of white is when this steak cooks, that fat is going to melt and impart the most beautiful flavor to your steak. Fat is your friend when it comes to steaks. External and internal equals muchos muchos flavor. Next up, the all-important seasoning. I'm not a believer of marinades, particularly when you've got an expensive cut of meat. You don't want to detract from the flavor. But what I like to use as a flavor enhancer is a combination of Worcestershire sauce, Liam Perrins ideally, and extra virgin olive oil. Equal amounts of both. Now, what the Worcester sauce does is it adds more of a seasoning than a marinade. But good Worcestershire sauce should have anchovy essence in it, as well as tamarind paste in it. And these bring out the umami flavor in meat, giving it almost a more meaty flavor. There are a number of detractors of seasoning before you cook the meat, because they'll tell you that the salt dries the meat out. Well, all I can say is, what a load of bollocks. The whole idea and the science behind salt and pepper going on before your meat hits the pan or the grid, whatever you're cooking on, is the salt sears into the surface of the steak, giving it that lovely salty umami flavor, cooks onto the meat like a crust. And when that first slice, you cut into it, and it's that heavenly savory flavor that only comes from putting the salt on before you cook it. Let's talk about heat source. Whether you throw this on a fire like I'm going to, or you do it in a cast iron pan, you want it as hot as humanly possible. Not hot enough to burn the steak, but you want to get a nice sizzle and a steer. You want to hear that sound when your steak hits the heat. Now, I'm cooking 2 of these bad boys because there's no ways I'm sharing mine. First things first, you can see I'm holding some tongs. Resist the temptation to keep turning. We're going to turn this maybe 45 degrees, just so we can get some sexy grill marks on. But every time you lift the steak out of the pan or off of the fire, you take it off of the heat, and so you slow the process down. Right, let's flip these bad boys over. Ooh, ho, ho, ho. Now, getting some lovely grill marks on here. This is where the flavor lives. These steaks look like they're almost done. I want them nice medium rare on the rare side. Now you'll see steak chefs will give this a little bit of a prod. There's method to the madness. If you take your hand and put your finger and your thumb together, don't push them together, just touch them together. You feel this part, the fleshy part of your palm. That's what a rare steak feels like. Medium rare, medium, and then obviously cooked to buggery and beyond. But that's what you're looking for. Prodding your steak, feeling that softness, should correlate to that, then you've got it right. When it comes to cooking steak, always err on the side of caution. Rather undercook them and have to put them back in the pan or back on the fire than overdo them, because there's no way back from that. Now the steaks come off the fire, out of the pan, off the heat, whatever you're cooking with. Now is a very, very important step. We're talking resting. Resting is of crucial importance. It really is. What happens to a piece of meat when it hits the pan, hits the oven, the grill, whatever it is the meat starts to contract. As it contracts, it starts to expel all the juices from the cells, and they flood towards the heat source. So even if you cook the steak perfectly, put it on a table, slice it, the first thing that's going to happen is that gorgeous flavor is just going to leach all over your board. So resting is of paramount importance. What resting does is it allows the meat to relax and those juices to get drawn back into the middle of the piece of meat. Retains the juice, it keeps a beautiful color. Now, classic. The longer you cook for, the longer the resting time is. You're looking at about 20% of the cooking time to rest. So on a steak that we're going to do, the steaks we're doing today, probably 6 or 7 minutes. So no more than a minute 30 that you're actually resting. You won't believe the results. Even if you're cooking it well done, it helps to retain some of the juice. The juices might be clear, but at least it means that the steak remains nice and moist. While my steak is resting, I'm going to spoon a little of my butter, a nice dollop on top. And that's just as the steak rests, They're just going to melt on my steak. Let's have a look at this bad boy. I'm going to cut into this. That is glorious. Beautiful, pink, medium rare. Cooking the perfect steak is all about simplicity. And like all simple cooking, there's nowhere to hide. You've got to get every single element right. And it starts with shopping. Getting the heat source right, seasoning, resting, all of these elements done properly in the right order, and you will have the perfect steak. So until next time, may the sauce be with you.